The Montana Territory, November 1949. When the elderly widow Agnes Mallory slowly dragged a 20-foot-long Quonset hut shell along the frozen dirt road back to her rotting log cabin in Cold Creek Valley, everyone at the trading post was convinced she had lost her mind. That corrugated metal arch, surplus military gear from a decommissioned depot, was never meant for living in. It was designed to store supplies, house machinery, anything except draping over an old cabin like some bizarre second skin. But Agnes had no intention of building a new home inside that steel shell. She was creating something no one in Cold Creek had ever seen, a cabin fully enclosed within a windshield. And when the winter of 1949 hit with temperatures cold enough to freeze water solid in wooden buckets and crack even the sturdiest livestock barns, that ridiculed metal shell became the fragile boundary between survival and despair for the old woman and her grandson. What made a frail, penniless widow understand heat loss in ways that even the most experienced local builders overlooked? If you want to discover one real frontier heating technique each week that actually saved lives during the harshest winters, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling where you're watching from, because this story shows that the coldest places produce the cleverest solutions. Agnes Mallory was no grand dreamer. She was just an elderly widow nearing 60, living alone with her young grandson in a log cabin built back in 1905, when Cold Creek was still sparsely settled. By the standards of the time, that house had once been an acceptable shelter. Thick sawn pine logs, rough stone foundation, steeply pitched roof to shed snow easily. But that solidity meant nothing when the mountain winds swept down from the Bitterroot Range each winter. The previous winter of 1949 had taught her a brutal lesson. A sealed cabin was an illusion. Wind found every crack in the decayed chinking. Cold pierced the logs as if they were mere thin boards. In January alone that year, she burned nearly all the firewood she'd gathered in the fall, feeding the stove every few hours, yet every morning she still found frost coating the inside walls. Her 8-year-old grandson had to sleep in his winter coat, coughing endlessly from the chill seeping through every knot in the wood. Agnes herself, slowed by age and breath in hands, no longer had the strength to wake every 3 hours through the night to stoke the fire like the younger families in the area could. And no matter how she patched one spot or sealed another, the temperature inside the cabin on the mildest days hovered only around 42 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The problem wasn't the house. The problem was physics. Wind doesn't just cool the air. It strips heat from walls through convection, slamming into each log and pulling warmth outside faster than any stove could replace it. And Cold Creek lay between two mountain ranges, like a funnel catching every strongest gust. Agnes understood this deeply. Every time she heard the wind howling through the log gaps, she remembered her son's death years earlier, also from a cold she had been powerless to fight. That fear haunted her throughout the summer of 1949. As late summer passed and Agnes Mallory realized she could not survive another winter in that drafty cabin, she turned back to her late husband's old trunk and found the sketchbook about Quonset huts the military had used in World War II. The notes about a dead airspace, 20 to 24 inches wide, blocking wind, stopping convection, retaining heat struck her like a suggestion from the past. By September, when a surplus depot in Missoula was liquidating leftover wartime steel arches, she saw her chance. A 20-foot-wide, 28-foot-long Quonset shell was selling for $65, nearly all her savings, but still within reach. She bought one, cut it into smaller sections for easier transport, and hauled it back to the cabin, under the wide-eyed stares of passers-by. Her plan was simple enough to seem foolish. Build a wooden frame around the existing cabin, maintaining a precise 24-inch air gap on all sides, then drape the steel arch over the entire structure. The curved shell would stop the wind before it reached the wood. The still airspace would become a natural buffer where wind couldn't flow through or create convective currents stealing heat from the walls. This wasn't a bold project or innovative ambition. It was just improvisation born from the desperation of an old woman who no longer had the strength to burn 6 cords of wood each winter. She didn't call it a double wall design or thermal envelope. She just looked at her shivering grandson each night and thought, what if the wind can't touch the cabin? By the end of October, her creation stood complete. The curved steel ribs embraced the cabin like a rusted exoskeleton, bolted to the wooden frame, maintaining the exact 24-inch gap between metal and old wood. Agnes cut small vent slots herself to prevent moisture buildup. The chimney passed through both the cabin and steel shell via a double-flanged collar she fabricated from scrap tin. She even built a wind-locked entryway with 2 patched but sealed doors. From the outside, it looked like a giant shed had swallowed the house inside. But standing in the dim corridor between the 2 shells, feeling the wind unable to penetrate, Agnes whispered, "Finally, there's hope." The physics behind what she had built was simple, even though it went against everything frontier people believed was right. Agnes started the work alone, almost as soon as the first steel ribs were laid in the backyard of the cabin. Nearing 60, her back was slightly stooped, her knuckles ached whenever the weather shifted, but she still dragged each 2x6 timber behind the house, setting them in a ring around the cabin like a careful but aging carpenter. She used her husband's old pencil to measure the 24-inch gap all around the cabin, marking and noting in her tattered twine-bound notebook, each figure carefully rewritten, as if even a slight error could shatter the fragile hope she clung to. When raising the wooden frame, she drove 2x6 pine posts tight along the cabin's perimeter, every hand-hammered nail sending a jolt through her hands. But she kept going slowly, without quitting. The frame gradually took shape, precisely matched to the Quonset's length so that when placed, it wouldn't shift or lean. For the heaviest part, lifting the rusted steel panels, she hired 2 village teenagers, boys who at first giggled and called her the eccentric old lady, but were curious enough to earn a few dollars. Agnes patiently showed them how to grip the steel edges, how to position it on the frame without slipping, how to balance it when the wind shifted. But when a sudden cold rain hit, the boys left early, leaving her alone in the yard, bent over dragging the final panel into place. That's when locals started gathering to watch, and the mocking comments rang out clearly. "The old woman will lock herself in a tin box. In summer, it'll be hot as an oven. Stay away. She's lost her mind." Agnes didn't reply, only saying one thing while tightening another joint. Wind shows no mercy to the old. Once the arch was secured, she sawed a few boards to build a small entry, an improvised airlock to retain heat each time the door opened. She handled the chimney by cutting 2 holes through both cabin and steel shell, then stuffing mineral wool from her husband's old stash into the gaps to prevent fire and heat loss. When the structure finally stood complete, her cabin looked like a house swallowed whole by a metal beast, the curved steel embracing it in a rough and bizarre shell. Agnes sat on her old porch chair, breathing heavily from exhaustion, hands trembling but eyes shining in an unusual way. She pulled her grandson close, stroked his hair, and said softly, "This winter, we won't shiver anymore." In the days that followed, with the steel shell draped over the cabin like rough armor, Agnes began testing whether what she had built would truly help or was just an old person's delusion clinging to final hope. The first thing she understood clearly: traditional log cabins failed not because earlier builders were incompetent, but because wood, no matter how thick, remains a poor insulator when assaulted by strong wind. A gust of just 40 miles per hour could increase wall heat loss 15 to 20 times. Every decayed chinking gap let wind pierce straight through, pulling heat out faster than any stove could replenish. That's why her cabin had never exceeded 45 degrees Fahrenheit on the bitterest nights. But the dead air space she created between cabin and steel shell was different. Still, air is nearly free insulation, a principle as simple as double-paned modern windows. By maintaining a 24-inch gap around the cabin, Agnes had unintentionally recreated the exact structure that prevented heat escape via convection, with wind unable to generate thermal eddies there. And the outer curved steel? That was the greatest advantage. If wind hits a flat wall like a log cabin's, it creates turbulence and continuously strips heat. But when wind meets a curved surface, the impact force disperses and slides along the arch to the ridge, reducing pressure on the structure by up to 70%. Instead of a direct blow, wind merely glances off. That's something a standalone log cabin could never achieve. Additionally, log cabins at night always radiate infrared heat, invisible warmth, escaping the logs and vanishing into the cold air. But the outer steel reflected some of that radiation back, keeping it around the cabin longer, like a crude mirror bouncing warmth. To prove it all, Agnes lit a small candle in the space between the shells. The flame stood straight, unwavering, not flickering as it always did when wind seeped through the cabin. That was the clearest sign. No convection, no air current strong enough to breach the buffer she had created. She wrote in her tattered notebook, in shaky but sharp script, "The wind here has lost its teeth." But even as the steel shell began proving its stability, the small community around Cold Creek did not easily accept an old person daring to do what they considered reckless. At the general store at the edge of town, the group of men who gathered by the stove for coffee and news now had a new topic. "She's at that age, mind slipping," one said, shaking his head as if in pity. Another smirked. "No one lives in a steel box through winter. Who does she think she is? Some engineer?" The tones ranged from bitter to concerned, but all converged on one conclusion. Agnes had gone too far. Rumors quickly reached Eldon Graves, the most respected master carpenter in the area. He was the one everyone trusted on building matters. Eldon came to the cabin, walked around it twice, examined every steel panel, tapped the wooden frame, then stopped at the door where Agnes was working. "Metal will condense moisture. The inner wood will rot. You'll collapse before January," he said, not joking at all. Agnes set down her hammer, wiped her forehead, and replied gently, without arguing, "I'm not afraid of water, Eldon. I'm afraid of the cold." Her answer silenced him for a moment before he left, but his verdict quickly became the new talking point. People started giving her cabin mocking names. Tin Shed of Madness, the Crazy Old Lady's Tin House, the Metal Cocoon. Children passing her yard pointed and giggled. Some even teased her grandson until he burst into tears and ran inside. Agnes watched, heart tightening, but she didn't waver. The emotional pressure grew heavier. An old friend visited, looked around the structure, and sighed. "Agnes, at your age, you can't handle this stress. Why torment yourself?" Agnes closed the notebook in her hand, voice low but firm. "Old age hasn't broken me. The cold already did that once. But soon enough, the villagers' mockery no longer mattered, because winter arrived in a way no one was prepared for. At first, it was just gusts of 30 to 40 miles per hour sweeping the valley, bringing sheets of snow to cover roofs and fields. Temperatures dropped to negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit, a cold the Cold Creek residents were still used to enduring. But just days later, a high-pressure mass from Alberta poured in, bringing skin-cutting cold. Temperatures fell from negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit, then negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and with strong winds, the wind chill reached negative 55 degrees Fahrenheit for days on end. Traditional cabins began to fail. Water in buckets froze even near the stove. Interiors coated with thin frost. Children slept in heavy coats, wrapped in multiple blankets, yet still shivering. Parents took turns staying awake to feed the fire, because if the stove went out even briefly, the cold would stab straight through the walls. Small tragedies emerged. An elderly man at the valley's end nearly died from bedroom chill. A large barn collapsed under the weight of wet snow exceeding the roof's limit. One family abandoned their unheatable home to evacuate to relatives. And amid the entire valley struggling in steel-hard cold, people's eyes gradually turned toward the old woman's strange cabin where the Quonset shell still stood firm, unshaken, unfrosted. They began to wonder, could the thing they had all mocked be the only one successfully holding out against this merciless winter? Then the true winter of 1949 descended on Cold Creek, not with an immediate blow, but with initial warning gusts strong enough to put residents on alert without yet causing panic. Winds of 30 to 40 miles per hour swept through the valley, whipping fresh snow into hazy white sheets that coated roofs, fences, and the trails leading into the pine forests. Temperatures dropped to negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit in the early days, a cold that locals had endured for years, so they still saw it as just an early winter, nothing too unusual. But everything changed when a high-pressure mass from Alberta poured in, bringing a deep freeze unseen in decades. Temperatures plummeted as if yanked into an abyss, negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit, then negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit. And in just 2 days, the mercury hit negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit. With strong winds, the wind chill plunged to negative 55 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to crack wood, contract steel, and make any outdoor movement dangerous within minutes. The valley sank into an eerie silence, broken only by the howling wind like the groaning of the earth and sky. Traditional log cabins began failing quickly. Water in buckets near the stove froze solid in hours, the insides of windows and log walls coated with thick white frost, as if snow from outside was slowly creeping in to claim the house. Children slept in winter coats, their breath forming misty clouds each time they turned. Parents took turns staying awake all night to feed the fire, because if the stove went out even briefly, the cold would slip through every gap, stripping heat faster than they could produce it. Homes considered well-built suddenly revealed their limits against a cold unlike any previous winter. And then small tragedies began to occur, like the first signs of widespread defeat. An elderly man on the valley's edge was found in his bedroom with severely lowered body temperature, barely surviving thanks to neighbors discovering him in time. A large barn on an eastern ranch collapsed when heavy wet snow piled on the roof exceeded the beam's tolerance. A family near the northern slope had to evacuate to relatives because their cabin could no longer hold heat, despite burning nearly all their season's firewood reserve. With each passing day, the cold seemed to grow thicker, deeper, as if intent on choking the entire valley. And in that context, as even homes accustomed to Montana winters began to tremble, the eyes of many those who had mocked, doubted, scorned, gradually turned toward the old widow Agnes Mallory's strange structure. The curved steel shell still stood firm, unfrosted, unshaken, as if that ferocious winter was happening somewhere far away. While the entire valley struggled with skin-cutting cold, Agnes Mallory awoke to a morning unlike any winter she had ever experienced. She rose after a rare long sleep, one not interrupted by wind, whistling through log gaps or cold, forcing her out of bed to stoke the fire. What surprised her most was that the stove had gone out 8 hours earlier. Yet inside the cabin, it wasn't cold like every previous year. With hands trembling from age but full of excitement, she opened her notebook, pulled out the small thermometer her husband had once used, and placed it in the middle of the room. The mercury slowly climbed and stopped at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. She stood frozen, unable to believe her eyes. 58 degrees Fahrenheit after 8 hours without adding wood. Just to confirm, she gently tossed in some leftover wood scraps. The flame flared small, but soon after, the temperature rose to 63 degrees Fahrenheit, as if the cabin was truly wearing a warm coat. Agnes clutched the thermometer tightly, eyes blurring. She began to cry, small sobs escaping in the quiet space. Not from pride, but because for the first time in years, she felt she hadn't lost to winter. Inside the cabin, life felt like it had shifted to autumn. Her grandson, instead of huddling in blankets, sat playing with blocks on the wooden floor without needing a coat, his small hands no longer purple from cold. No frost coated the window frames. No wind whistled through wall gaps. No thick white breath clouds like in past winters. The space between the cabin and steel shell became a dry, quiet buffer, completely isolating the house from the mountain wind's violence. Agnes stood there, in a room warm like October, feeling for the first time in her life a peace no wind could touch. But that peace soon drew the gaze of those who had mocked her. First came Eldon Graves, the most respected carpenter in the area, and the loudest opponent of her project. He arrived after hearing her cabin wasn't freezing inside, something he deemed impossible. Eldon opened the door and stepped in, and his face, usually full of a craftsman's confidence, changed involuntarily. He stood silent for seconds, took a deep breath, and exclaimed, "Lord, it's like October." Those words weren't praise, they were acknowledgement. For the first time, Eldon Graves, trusted by the whole area for his expertise, couldn't explain what he was feeling. From that moment, rumors spread faster than the storm outside. Those who had laughed at Agnes whispered among themselves, "The old lady was right. That steel shell, it really holds heat. Maybe we were wrong." Many families began doubting their own cabins, something unheard of in a place where everyone believed tradition was absolute truth. That night, as wind still howled through the valley with cold enough to shatter glass, Agnes's cabin glowed with steady warmth. And for the first time that winter, neighbors looked toward that bizarre metal house, not with mockery, but with curiosity mixed with hope, as if witnessing something they never dared believe could exist in this harsh land. Word of Agnes's unusually warm house spread so quickly that just 3 days later, Carbon County sent building inspector Howard Brimley to investigate. He was known for caution, reticence, and absolute disbelief in folklore. So when told a log cabin covered in steel stays warm in -30 degrees Fahrenheit storms, his first reaction was skepticism about errors or exaggeration. That morning, Howard arrived in Cold Creek with official meteorological tools: standard mercury thermometer, hygrometer, micro wind speed device, and a thick notebook. Winds still lashed in gusts. Snow whipped into long white streaks across the ground like smoke. He stood before Agnes's cabin, glancing at the rusted but sturdy Quonset shell, then opened his notebook and wrote, "Inspecting non-traditional structure resident reports." When Howard opened the door and stepped in, the warmth hit him, fogging his glasses instantly. He blinked repeatedly, surprised yet wary, then placed his first device in the room's center. Outside, it was -31 degrees Fahrenheit per Red Lodge station records that morning. But in Agnes's cabin, the mercury shot up to 64 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there, as if the house was connected to some central heating he couldn't see. He checked again, then a third time. No error. No mistake. 64 degrees in such outdoor conditions, something no traditional log cabin in the area could achieve. Next, Howard examined the air gap between wood and steel. He shone a flashlight, inspected every joint, measured humidity with the hygrometer, reading stable. No condensation, no dripping water, no frost contrary to every prior prediction from Carpenter Eldon and most Cold Creek residents. No cold airflow, no convection signs. The dead air space worked perfectly, just like the technical notes Agnes had learned from her husband's book. Howard was silent a long while, then wrote, "Temperature differential inside versus outside, 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Cabin maintains stable heat with estimated fuel consumption 30% of area average." He asked Agnes to show her firewood use since season start, and seeing the pile still nearly 2/3 full, he just sighed, a sigh of someone forced to admit his preconceptions were wrong. Finally, looking around the house where her grandson played in steady warmth, walls unfrosted, outer steel transmitting no cold despite howling winds, Howard closed his notebook and said softly, almost disbelieving his own words, "An old widow has beaten Montana wind." No greater praise existed in a land where men prided themselves on survival and strength. That afternoon, he returned to the county office and filed an official report to the state of Montana. In the 13-page document, he detailed the operating principle, temperature measurements, structural evaluation, and recommended further study. It ended with a rare personal note. This case shows the most effective solution doesn't always come from the strongest or most experienced, sometimes from someone just trying to keep her family warm. And from that moment, the story of an old widow and her bizarre Quonset shell was no longer rumor. It became data, evidence, and something that made an entire state curious. Engineer Howard Brimley's report spread as fast as the gusts lashing the valley, and within days, a chain reaction began. Families who had mocked Agnes now quietly observed her cabin from afar. And then one morning, the Pattersons living half a mile away were the first to knock and ask to see inside the steel shell. Soon after, they built a wooden frame around their own cabin and started hunting old steel panels for cladding, despite neighbors whispering they were copying the crazy old lady. 2 other families followed, each adapting it, as long as they created a dead airspace like Agnes's design. Then 2 widows in the area, both exhausted from waking every 3 hours to stoke fires, came asking her to teach framing and maintaining the exact 24-inch gap. Agnes wasn't one to instruct, but she understood the helplessness of cold, piercing bones, so she guided them step by step. No charge, no payment, just saying, "I was just trying to stop shivering." The impact of this method quickly spread beyond Cold Creek. A ranch in eastern Wyoming heard the story through acquaintances and enclosed their livestock barn in a shell, saving nearly the entire herd through -30 degrees Fahrenheit nights without extra coal. In Idaho, a small school in Salmon, where winds swept hard from the Bitterroots, covered 2 windward walls with curved wood arches, reducing heat loss enough for children to learn without winter coats all season. By early February, Montana Homestead Bulletin magazine, for farmers and homesteaders, ran a long article with sketches of Agnes's cabin. The bold headline read, Old Widow's shell system cuts fuel in half. It described her method as an effective way to combat mountain wind chill, emphasizing that materials weren't the difference, but shape and the still air layer between structures. As the article circulated, other areas adapted to their conditions. Some, without surplus steel, used pole barns, large wooden frames for outer cladding. Others used heavy canvas over frames to block wind, turning cabins into temporary but effective wind tents. Areas with abundant cordwood stacked logs into outer walls, creating thick shells with inner gaps, working like Agnes's dead air principle. Each place a variation, but all born from one idea: stop wind before it hits the heat-retaining wall. And at the center of these changes, Agnes Mallory became the unexpected teacher of the valley. Men who once saw her as a joke now stood by her cabin, listening as she explained why the 24-inch gap must be exact, why vents needed placement above snow accumulation to avoid moisture. She never acted superior or claimed invention of anything great. Instead, when thanked, she just smiled, voice raspy with age. "I was just trying to stop shivering." But those simple words, in a context where the whole area was learning from her, carried more weight than any speech. The cabin, once called Tin Shed of Madness, became a destination for people from neighboring valleys to visit. They took notes, measured, asked every detail. Children no longer mocked Agnes's grandson, but stood before the metal shell with curious eyes. From an eccentric old woman, Agnes gradually became living proof that simple ideas, properly applied, could change an entire winter. In a place where muscle was believed key to survival, an old widow with trembling hands and stooped back was the first to prove that sometimes wisdom and perseverance are the true weapons. And from Cold Creek, an unexpected method was quietly spreading, simply called the Ellsworth method. 2 decades passed since that harsh winter, when Agnes Mallory became the center of a change she never anticipated. People say time erodes everything, but it couldn't erode the rightness of an idea suited to nature. Her old cabin still stood, nestled under the time-faded Quonset shell but unrotted. The once thin steel panels remained unwarped, uncracked, showing no weakness against mountain winds, as if born to embrace that cabin forever. The 24-inch airspace, her invisible armor built alone, remained dry, unmolded, operating exactly as her husband's technical notes described. And though Agnes had passed years earlier, the cabin's warmth stayed as in her lifetime, testament that what she built wasn't just against one winter, but to change how an entire region understood cold. Her grandson, who once played blocks on the floor in 63 degrees Fahrenheit warmth, had become a renowned climate engineer. He specialized in insulated air shells and was often invited to lecture on this cheap yet powerful solution at Western technical schools. In every presentation, he told the story of an old grandmother, with trembling hands and stooped back, who created a structure engineers of the time hadn't considered. He always ended with a line that silenced students. "I learned engineering from university, but I learned survival from my grandmother." Agnes's fame spread beyond Cold Creek. Mountain cabins in Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, and Montana all had their versions of the method. Locals called it affectionately Ellsworth shell, not by material or technique, but by the woman who first dared challenge mountain winds with tenacity and intuition. One June day, before Agnes's cabin, now preserved as a small county landmark, they erected a memorial plaque of pine wood and recycled steel. It bore just 4 simple lines. She wasn't strong, she wasn't young, she wasn't wrong, she was right. Those lines, to Cold Creek residents, spoke not just of Agnes, but the lesson the valley took years to accept. That tradition doesn't always ensure survival, that what everyone knows can keep people in the cold, that the wisdom of the elderly, even mocked, even dismissed, can save an entire land if people listen. And when temperatures dropped to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit in another winter, families living in shells inspired by Agnes realized the greatest truth. It doesn't matter who was right or wrong, but who saw what everyone else overlooked. If you want to keep exploring survival stories full of wisdom like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Thanks for watching. See you next week on the journey.